Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and mental health. I'm clinical psychologist Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host Dr. Reid Robison and I are discussing self-compassion, why it's so hard but so important to forgive, and how one might detox from the toxifying effects of judgment. Quick note, if you'd like to get in contact with us, you can email us at psychfrontiers@novamind.ca. We'd like to do an Ask Me Anything episode pretty soon, so if you have any questions or ideas of what you'd like to hear me and Reid discuss, please send them our way. Also, if there's another human being that you'd like to hear us talk to on the show, please email us those recommendations. They can be somebody who's, in the psychedelic medicine, mental health space, or someone who you just think might be interesting for us to chat with. We'd love to hear your suggestions. With that out of the way, please enjoy the show. Welcome back, everybody, to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers. It's just Reid and I today, but I guess I shouldn't say just, because you know what, Reid? We're pretty awesome.
Amen. No, only us.
In the spirit of our topic today, I say that we're pretty awesome. It's an exercise in non-self-judgment, I guess negative judgment, because I guess I'm judging us to be awesome. But today we're going to be talking about judgment, self-compassion, and forgiveness. These are topics I think are super relevant to mental health generally, but they're relevant to me personally. Growing up, I'm a child of the 80s and 90s. I was born in 1983. I'm not too old yet, although my graying beard and bald head might suggest otherwise. I was raised in that generation of self-esteem. I remember even having little self-esteem like units in elementary school. You guys are awesome. You were born incredible, and I don't know. It just didn't work for me. It created kind of a weird conflict where I'm being told that I'm good no matter what, but then I'm not in the math class that my friends are in, or I'm not the athlete that my friends are. I start comparing myself to others and I find that I'm lacking. So it creates this weird dissonance.
Yeah, I've seen that play out a lot where you boost someone up in ways that aren't even true. Like, we see it on American Idol.
Right.
Like you're the best singer in the world, you can do this, and then you get out there on a stage in front of so many people, and if your singing is in fact terrible and it's a flop, or you just get it doesn't turn out how you want it to be, then that's a long way to fall.
Yeah, it makes me think of the difference between self-esteem. I hold myself in high esteem versus something like self-love or self-compassion, what we're talking about today. That seems more, mature, stable, reasonable.
Yeah.
Not that you can't like yourself. I think it's there's a lot of things about me now that I like.
Self-like.
Yeah. But there are things about me that I don't like, and some of that dissatisfaction motivates me to improve. But some of it doesn't, right? Some of it turns, if I'm not careful, can turn into self-loathing. And that's not healthy. I think we can agree.
I like self-compassion as a way to sum it all up, because there's been this self-love movement in recent years that in general is a great thing, but it's easy to get down on yourself if you're not immediately there, or it's can be a trap for some to think of we need to love ourselves instantly, unconditionally, whereas self-compassion, it just presents this framework for a more attainable approach to no matter what mistakes we make, no matter what happens, we can be compassionate towards ourselves, or more and more compassionate.
Yeah. Because if I'm thinking just first thing that comes to my mind when I think of self-love, I might be in danger of approval. Like, I approve everything about me or everything that I do. And to me, I can't metabolize that. I can't digest that. I don't know that I approve of everything I do, because sometimes I'll do something and it doesn't sync up with my values. I'm tired, I'm impulsive, and I snap at my kid. And so if I'm practicing self-love, I mean, we're going to split hairs here, but am I saying, well, it's fine. I'm justified in snapping at my kid. I was tired. It's fine. Or can I practice some self-compassion and say, hey, none of us are perfect. Like, we make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sad that what I said was harmful to my child. I grieve my mistake. I grieve that I am only human and that my humanity, I can't avoid that my humanity will harm my children in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not going to punish myself anymore for having done that. I'm going to practice some self-compassion, and then in that self-compassion, reorient and hopefully do better.
Reminds me of one of the core tenets of DBT, that therapy modality that we are all familiar with and dish out in one way or another now and then. The dialectic of I'm doing the best I can and I have work to do. Like, those things can and often are true at the same time.
Yeah. The I have work to do piece, I think, is sometimes lost on the self-love, self-esteem crowd at an extreme end of the spectrum. But you can take any of it to extremes, I guess. There's the I have work to do that is very self-rejecting. In the past in the podcast, we've talked about the yin and yang, the masculine and the feminine. And if you're out of balance in those two domains, it's not healthy. So you can get to the point where it's, I have work to do, I have so much work to do that it's overwhelming, or I have so much work to do, I'm not good at anything, and it becomes self-rejecting.
Yeah, and these things can spin out of control in certain conditions, like eating disorders that we've talked about a fair amount, and OCD, of course. There's a subtype with a religiosity or guilt, intense guilt, where I've had clients in the past where they couldn't stop themselves at times in their life from picking up all the trash on, say, a college campus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, scrupulosity was something that's a feature of OCD that often takes on the religious obsessions, this obsession with purity, being clean, being right in the eyes of God, that I saw a lot as a college counselor.
Mm-hmm.
When I went to graduate school at Brigham Young University, and as part of my training, I worked in their counseling and career center. And a lot of my clients were these deeply religious folks who also happened to have OCD, and the OCD sort of glommed onto that. And it was, I need to be clean, I need to be pure, I need to be perfect. And it casts doubt continually on the fact, on whether or not I am. So and the compulsions were usually something like confession. They'd go to their religious leader and confess all their quote unquote sins. And it can be debilitating, because then they start having the thought crimes obsessions, right? Like, well, I was reading the Bible and it says to look upon a woman to lust after her is to commit adultery in your heart. So I did see this woman on campus, and I noticed her figure and I was kind of aroused by it. And so does that mean I committed adultery? And I mean, it can be nightmarish.
Yeah, no, we've seen it way too many times and experienced a fair amount of it growing up in cultures with strong kind of religious upbringing, where it's way too easy to get extremely down on yourself or hyper-critical of normal things, like that we all make mistakes, or that we all have desires, or that we're all learning and doing the best we can with where we are on our journeys.
I think that makes it difficult if you grow up in an ideology, whether it's a family ideology, a cultural ideology, a religious ideology, that has very strong opinions about right and wrong, strong opinions about good and bad, and how you ought to behave to be right and how you ought to behave to be good. It's hard not to develop a really, really critical self-judge, or it's difficult not to be self-rejecting in some ways. And I think self-compassion, if there is an antidote, is it.
Yeah, it's one of the dark sides of, what might have otherwise been a positive intention of a religion, like bringing people together to commune with the divine in some way. But in the fear-based approaches, there's a big risk of people kind of living in intense terror of making mistakes or criticizing oneself over and over, where like, I've seen some terrible consequences in the mental health field of people who just were so down on themselves because of a pornography habit, for example, or messing up according to the culture's rules in one way or another repeatedly, that they just couldn't live with.
Yeah, it can be so debilitating, especially when the stakes are so high, right? For depending on the religious system or whatever, if you aren't doing what is right, then, I mean, and in the most extreme cases, you are going to go to hell. That after you die, it's fire for eternity. And I know that's not true of most religious systems, but it's true of some. And imagine that the pressure that puts on a person who really just wants to do good, but they keep running into their own humanity. You know, their own very, from our perspective as mental health professionals, understandable, even beautiful in its imperfection, humanity. And they're never not going to. And so it's a difficult, it makes for a difficult daily life.
Yeah. One of the most liberating points in my personal journey on this planet has been the time when I was able to shed and let go of that deeply ingrained kind of religious cultural guilt around perfectionism. And that was so freeing when I was able to just get some of those stones out of my backpack or shed some of those layers.
Yeah. You know, so you mentioned guilt, and that reminds me of the difference, the distinction we often make between shame and guilt, at least clinically. Like when I'm working with a client, I like to make this distinction because oftentimes they'll use the word guilt, but what they're actually talking about is shame.
Yeah, I probably used it incorrectly as well. I think it's an important distinction because guilt can be restorative and inspire positive corrective action, but shame is this internalized negative sense of self.
Right. That's the way I think about it too. You know, shame is I am bad, whereas guilt is I've done something, quote unquote, bad. And I don't love the good bad dichotomy, but it's a catchy way of describing it. So that's often how I'll describe it to my clients, because there certainly is a difference. If I've just done something that is not in alignment with my values, something that hurts others and I don't like that, hurts myself and I don't like that, you can recover from that. You can do better next time. You can apologize. You can make amends. But if making a mistake means you are bad, like you said, if it's part of your identity, that's hard to wiggle out of.
Yeah, no, that's a very difficult place to get stuck in, and that's why shame is at the root of so many mental health conditions, even ones you might not think about. Like there is a lot of shame underneath some PTSD, some eating disorders, so many other things, but even adult ADHD. You know, I've always been surprised at the rates of shame when it's been evaluated in different populations, and shame kind of by nature of what it is grows in the dark and can really be pernicious, like as it sits there and festers if we don't shine a light on it and figure out ways of processing and letting it go.
Yeah, I think sometimes you could make the argument that shame is at the core of some personality disorders. Like I think of, and we don't understand them all that well, not perfectly at least, but something like antisocial personality disorder or even narcissism, that you've got, it doesn't appear from their behavior that they experience a lot of shame or self-recrimination, but it could be underneath at the core.
Yeah. Narcissism is a good example because if you look at the root of the word for narcissism or narcissus, you could translate it into calloused. And you look at what does a callous mean? something that develops in a protective way over a wound. And so if you think about someone who you perceive as narcissistic, and say in your mind, like, that guy is, and that guy rubs me the wrong way, he's such a narcissist, but that comes off a certain way. But if you replace it with deeply wounded individual, for example, like, that guy is annoying because he is a deeply wounded individual. Boom. That's a lot more difficult to say out loud, and helps bring back the compassion towards others. And we can apply this to ourselves of, we all have wounds, and we all deal with those in different ways. And someone displaying in what might look like a self-centered way might be their way of responding to some deep, unhealed parts of themselves.
Right. Yeah, it's a good segue to the topic of judgment of others and judgment of self.
Yeah.
The social psychologists have a lot of really interesting research and data on what motivates judgment, like the way we judge. There's things like the fundamental attribution error or confirmation bias. If somebody messes up and we see them mess up, we will attribute their screw up to their idiocy. Whereas if we mess up, we will attribute it to the circumstances, more likely to do that at least.
Yeah.
I remember being in a conversation with a group of people, and people were talking about Donald Trump, and regardless of I don't care what your political leanings are, this is just a story. Okay, folks. So I know when you mention political people freak out. But
you said Trump. I
said Trump. Yeah, please keep listening to us. But so some people were being very critical of Donald Trump, and this person said, "Oh man, what a traumatized individual. He must have been a very traumatized individual." And to sort of ground the conversation to a halt, kind of like you were saying, it's like more difficult to admit that maybe this person that you find is despicable, even if by most subjective measures the person is despicable, they might be despicable because they're in pain.
We are all walking each other home, even Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well, and it's tough, man. It's tough when you try to apply mindfulness, compassion, and non-judgment to these figures. And I'm not comparing Trump to Hitler. I'm just saying human beings who elicit very strong opinions. So Hitler is one of them, right? Yeah. These people in history that people love to hate.
Speaking of judgment, because this is a Psychedelic Frontiers podcast, this makes me think of how we as clinicians can be judgy at times. We're all judgy in many ways, right? More than we admit as humans. But as clinicians, we can often be judgmental towards drugs. It might sound weird to say that, but think about your own biases towards, you might think plants are the best and chemicals are bad, for example. And we work with ketamine, and I've encountered that a lot. Like, people have said to me, and I'm not even judging whether they're wrong or right, but they've just said things like, "Oh, ketamine doesn't have a soul. Psilocybin does," something like that. But I heard this speaker once. It was a MAP Psychedelic Science Conference, the last one that happened pre-COVID, where Hart was speaking about drugs and not being judgmental about things. And I think it especially applies, or even applies in psychedelics, to not judge so heavily based on your opinions of, say, ayahuasca versus MDMA versus ketamine versus LSD versus psilocybin, ibogaine, things like that.
Right. Yeah, and just for the listeners who don't know, Dr. Carl Hart, what was the name of his book? Drugs for Grown-Ups, or is that it?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. He's been featured on Joe Rogan's podcast. He's gotten a lot of attention lately for his very non-judgmental approach to all substances, right? Not just the psychedelic ones.
Yeah, we are quick to judge as humans. We judge a lot.
We kind of have to, right? I mean, we talk about in psychology, we talk about cognitive heuristics, mental shortcuts. That if we didn't have them, then our brains would probably grind to a halt. I mean, it's a lot of sensory information we're taking in every second, every millisecond of the day.
Yeah.
And so we develop these shortcuts. And sometimes these shortcuts serve us. I would argue probably most of the time they serve us pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes they don't, right? Because sometimes those cognitive heuristics or these shortcuts will turn into stereotypes. Stereotypes aren't always bad, but sometimes stereotypes will then turn into prejudice, right? You'll have prejudice against a drug, prejudice against a group of human beings, prejudice against something that fits, that you think fits a stereotype. And I think, we talk a lot about mindfulness being the non-judgmental awareness of all things occurring in this box that we call our consciousness, this sensory box that we call consciousness, is an important part of this self-compassion piece.
Yeah, because we judge how people parent, we judge people's political views, we judge everyone's approach to the pandemic or masks or vaccines, things like that. And you're right, it is important to point out that these are evolutionarily wired or acquired mechanisms that might be spinning unconsciously out of control in the wrong direction towards prejudice or towards negative self-evaluation, but they are there for a purpose of kind of safety and protection and banding together as humans towards survival.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in an attitude of self-compassion, if we catch ourselves being judgmental, we might say, oh, well, thank you, self, or thank you, consciousness or evolution, for trying to protect me, or for making things a little bit easier for me, for coming up with these shortcuts.
Yeah.
But now I'm noticing that this judgment that I have no longer serves me. In school, I had this mentor, Dr. Brent Slife, psychologist, and he, more than probably anybody, apart from my parents, taught me how to think critically. And the way he described it, critical thinking was noticing and evaluating the assumptions that were behind ideas. And I mean, that served me so well. And so I try to do that to myself. I try to do that when I'm evaluating an opinion that I'm listening to in my social science research. Look at the assumptions. What is behind what the person is saying? What is behind what I'm doing right now? When I'm working with a client, I need to test my own assumptions about this client, and I need to do it all the time. Because we'll do a case formulation, which is a fancy way of saying we've got now some well thought out assumptions about this person based on the data we've collected.
Yeah.
But it's important that we don't let those assumptions last too long, that we allow them to be updated based on new information. I think a person's resistance to their ideas being updated is the source of a lot of suffering on this planet. It's the thing that starts wars and keeps wars going. It's something that keeps prejudices alive for hundreds of years or decades. Allow your firmware, your cognitive firmware, to be updated with good data and new information.
And you do that through mindful, compassionate awareness, right? Non-judgmental awareness, even though we will still judge. It's not about not judging. Exactly. It's about witnessing our judgment with as little judgment as possible and bringing compassion into the mix.
Yeah. And so maybe we didn't start by defining compassion. We talked about love, right? When we say compassion, Reid, what are we talking about?
Well, it reminds me of what we talk about sometimes with Carl Rogers and how back in the day he couldn't really talk about love because that was a taboo subject and had to call it unconditional positive regard. And compassion, it's a good question. What is the difference between compassion and love, whether we're talking about towards self or others?
What you could probably say, compassion is subsumed under the broader category of love. I know in our English language we have this one word, love, that in other languages they have many words to describe different types of love, different ways that love is expressed and felt and manifests. So maybe compassion is love, but I know that there's one component of self-compassion, and maybe this is Kristen Neff's work. I'm remembering like a three-legged stool of self-compassion, but one of those legs, if I remember right, is common humanity. Is this ringing a bell?
Yeah.
It's recognizing that you are no different in a lot of ways than anyone else. I'll have clients say, yeah, I know everyone makes mistakes, but, and I'll go, ho, hang on. You're an everyone, right? If you're going to say everyone makes mistakes, you're one of those.
Mm-hmm.
And, but it was taught to me once that what but really stands for is behold the underlying truth. So if you say but, everything you said before, you don't really mean, or you don't really believe. I'm sure there are ways this doesn't apply, but yeah, common humanity is one of those essential aspects of compassion and self-compassion. We're all in it together, like the Ram Dass quote you mentioned earlier, walking each other home.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember the other legs of the stool, or if it even was a three-legged stool, but I do remember common humanity.
Yeah, we do have this deep conditioning in society of towards perfectionism and leading to unlovability, or Tara Brach calls it a trance of unworthiness. This self-blame that we get stuck in can put us in this trance. We put on this protective armor and we don't give ourselves love or even receive it from others.
Mm-hmm. A trance of unworthiness. I love that.
And the path is waking up from that, taking off your spacesuit self, as she calls it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The concept of worthiness bugs me. I think it's because I was raised in a religion that talked about it a lot. The idea that I had to behave in a certain way in order to be worthy of what? Salvation, love, acceptance, affection. Like, screw you, man. I love the idea that, I guess it makes more sense to me now as I feel like I'm evolving and learning, that we're worthy by default. Or just the concept of worth maybe is one we should throw out. I mean, maybe it works for economists, but I don't know about for psychologists, psychiatrists.
Yeah, because you're born into this world as a whole and complete human being, even though you might not be able to take care of yourself when you first arrive on planet Earth. You're still worthy. Like, certainly, who would say a baby isn't worthy of love?
Right.
But we get quickly kind of stuck in, indoctrinated with this trance, or conditioned with this unlovability, or this conditional love based on how we perform or behave, that is just so unfortunate. I agree with throwing out that concept altogether of worthiness, because we are all complete, worthy, lovable human beings, even if we're not acting like it for a minute.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up babies, because, like, at what age would you say we now qualify for rejection? Like, at what age do you say we can now meet the criteria for not worthy of love? You're right. No sane person would think this baby is unworthy of love, but at some point, a lot of us will encounter that feeling of unworthiness. So if we were worthy of love, like you're saying, when we came into the world, why would it change?
Yeah, it's our perception, our self-evaluation of it that kind of runs amok as we go about life.
Self-rejecting. Yeah, socially constructed and reinforced, unfortunately. We were, before we started recording, we were talking about the time suck that is TikTok. It's pretty awesome, but it also is, a dopamine rabbit hole that's hard to get out of sometimes. Social media, TikTok included, it's, from one perspective, is a comparison engine, especially Instagram, right?
Yeah.
You're looking at other people's lives as depicted by these doctored photos and videos, And I'm on Instagram. Hell, follow me on Instagram, Dr. Steve Thayer. You'll see me in all my hideous glory, right? I don't I don't doctor anything.
Hey, that wasn't
that was very
kind to yourself.
True, but that was self-deprecating humor, which we can also talk about the difference, right?
At least you said glory is part of it.
That's true. I do feel pretty glorious. This beard's pretty glorious. Sometimes it's I don't know. I'm conflicted about the beard. I got to compensate for the hair loss, or maybe I don't. Damn it, Reid. Self-love is so hard.
Complicated.
It is. It's so hard.
But you're right. Scrolling through Instagram, the evidence will back it up, is not good for our self-evaluation, our positive self-image.
Right.
Like, it quickly starts to plummet because we are so prone to that comparison. And, eating disorders are a striking example of it, or even just disordered eating thoughts and behaviors that are present in the majority of us in one way, shape, or form, are just fueled in such an intense way by this social media era we live in and our kids are growing up in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you caught me using self-deprecating humor, and it makes me think about how we try to make ourselves comfortable sometimes by being self-critical. Like when I developed a lot of my sense of humor as an adolescent by trying to beat other people to the punch of being critical of me. Right? I knew that if I could make fun of me, and I felt like I was acutely aware of all my faults, painfully so, before someone else could, then I'd be safe. Right? Self-criticism and self-judgment became a way of protecting myself from rejection from others. And the psychoanalysts would say that humor is one of the more mature defense mechanisms, but
still a defense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that judgment is or can be a reflection of the disowned parts of ourselves, the parts of our shadows we don't accept, that we might encounter in others and quickly pass judgment onto because we haven't come to terms with all the hideous glory that it is to be human.
Yeah. And it's almost, a cliche that we hate or judge in others what we actually hate or judge in ourselves. Like we project that shadow part of ourselves onto others and are critical of it. But it's so true,
Triggers are friends to follow.
They are.
Right? What pushes buttons in us shows us our work, some unhealed, unconscious parts of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can follow those triggers. I mean, they're friends to follow because if you can follow them, you can find why you're sensitive, why they are triggers. What was the unmet need when you were a child that caused this kind of pain to be part of your personality?
Yeah, and that's an exercise we've dished out countless times in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy.
Did it yesterday, yeah.
Part of the FCAP emotion-focused ketamine-assisted psychotherapy protocol, and one we use, in all sorts of settings, but it involves looking for a recent trigger, right? Something that pushed a button in you. The more recent, the better, and it can be little, it can be silly. And then trying to trace it back, doing kind of an internal journey to what's the earliest time in your life you can recall where you felt that way. Mm-hmm. And you got to articulate the feeling, like I felt rejected, I felt unseen, unheard, disrespected, whatever it may be. Then you go there and you're like, whoa, there's this memory when I was 10 and lost in a grocery store crying, or whatever it may be. Maybe that's not the right age for this type of example, but and then you go there and you think of the unmet needs at the time, and you can actually in that process start to meet those needs. Like imagine offering yourself reassurance and comfort and meeting those needs in whatever way you can, and notice what happens in the body at the time. And it's amazing, what it can do to those kind of deep unhealed parts of ourselves. And we can do this practice all the time. You could do that all day, every day, as things trigger you. And that's the rapid course, the accelerated path in shadow work to working on yourself.
Right. And I love how psychedelics, ketamine included, facilitates that work.
Yeah.
It allows pretty ready access to the shadow. And I experienced this the other day when I was doing a guided ketamine session with a client. And we did the presence process on the tail end of her ketamine trip experience as she was, coming back and could talk. And could
the process of self-exploration.
And she went back, we did it as you just described, recalled a memory where she felt ignored and isolated and alone, being a very little child, and wanted attention, wanted to know that she mattered. And I coached her to imagine her adult self being present. And this was a time when she felt very unsafe as a child. And this client continues to feel unsafe to this day as an adult. And it's very guarded and tense. Mm-hmm. And with the ketamine on board, she was able to really relax the barriers, put the shield down, and give that younger self love from her older self. Super powerful for this person. And this is something that we'd done share work before that was hard for her to do. It's just what keeps me coming back to the psychedelic work, and why we're so excited and passionate about it is the doors that sometimes it can unlock for people who are trying hard anyway, right? We're all trying hard. It just greases the skids a bit, at least.
Yeah, it kind of melts away those structures that limit us, the rules we've picked up along the way that limit these new pathways from firing together and new insights and, getting you out of your day-to-day default mode and comfort zone where you might judge chair work or not think it's doable for you to go reparent yourself or offer love and comfort or do that kind of work. But then it breaks down those walls, lets these new pathways fire together and new insights happen. It's beautiful.
Yeah. One of my early psychedelic experiences personally, I remember having the thought, while the forest was melting and all the other stuff that tends to happen when you're on psychedelics, I remember having the thought, oh, this is mindfulness. I thought I understood mindfulness before, being a meditator and a therapist and being educated in it. But I felt like I experienced uncorrupted access to my emotions, uncorrupted by judgment, by conditioning, by assumptions, in a way that I'd never experienced it before. And it was in that moment I was like, okay, I've got to find a way to use psychedelics in my work as a mental health professional, because this is good shit.
Good shit.
Yeah.
Emotions are a good example because they're such powerful signals that give us information on what we need to navigate life in a good way, yet we judge them or swat them away so quickly, especially certain emotions for certain people based on how you were raised and as what gender and what societal norms were imposed on you. Like, as a woman, for example, growing up in this culture, it might not have been acceptable for you to display anger, which is really, really sad and tragic because there's a healthy, empowered anger that we all need at times to drive us to action,
right.
Protective action of our own, selves or loved ones or truth and boundaries. And as men growing up in this society, maybe it wasn't safe to display emotion or acceptable. And so we'd swat away sadness. But sadness is this, very important emotional state as well that gives us information about our need for like comfort or closeness or things like that from others.
Yeah, mindful acceptance, non-judgmental awareness of and acceptance of emotions is such hard work, and it is the work. It's so important, the work to do. It's work that I struggle with myself. We've talked before about our discomfort with the emotions of our children even.
Yeah.
My kid is crying, and I just feel this instinct, I gotta fix this. I gotta help him not be sad. And with good intentions, I might say, don't cry, or it's not a big deal. You're okay. Man,
Don't
I hear
be
that
sad.
phrase, don't be sad, but you're fine. Kid hits the ground, like trips, falls in their face. You're fine. You're fine. Well, what if they're not? Right?
Yeah.
Maybe they're not fine. And
It's okay, yeah.
in validating an emotional experience, we learn this early when the base layers of our personalities are being laid down. We learn, this, I'm not supposed to feel anger. Or when I feel anger, it's not acceptable to express it.
Yeah, and then our emotional states get fused, confused, mixed together, where we might be sad and in need of comfort, but we might have this new kind of reaction superimposed on it of anger, of pushing people away, when what we really need is someone to come closer and offer us comfort.
Right. So I can hear the objections in my mind of people saying, well, so what are you saying? Just feel full force everything that shows up in your consciousness? Just be super sad all the time, be super anxious all the time, be super angry all the time? Reid, are we telling people to just be unregulated emotion monsters?
Sure. No.
Why not?
No,
if that's what you're called to.
It's important to remember that emotions rise and fall, and they do not last forever. And if we're stuck in a certain negative emotional state, or even a positive one, like, there are other reasons for that. But in fact, the natural trajectory or arc of an emotion is actually a lot quicker than we think, and it will rise and fall. And the trouble comes when we start to squash it before it gets to its full completion, or gets to run its course.
If you give it room to move, then it will move through its natural course quickly.
Yeah, and it's not only that. Like, what happens to unshed tears? A rhetorical question, but repressing your emotions, it's going to spill out in other ways, whether it's physical, emotional, behavioral. But there's also, you're missing out on this wise intuition that the intelligence of your emotions brings, giving you information of what you need in life. Because every emotion comes with this bodily felt sense for you, and then an action tendency. It's actually, we can use that as our radar of what to do in life. And if we numb that out, you're kind of left at sea without a compass.
Yeah. Emotions are good messengers, important messengers. And if we haven't really learned to interpret the messages, this is hard work to do as an adult.
Yeah, why don't we learn that in school? I guess that's part of why we're sitting here talking about
That's why you and I have
feelings.
jobs, Reid. It's because we don't learn that in school.
Yeah.
People need help, learning it as adults. Yeah, there should be mindfulness classes, emotional intelligence classes. I mean, they barely taught us any. Well, anyway, I can go off about education, but there should be
should
classes.
learn how to love, learn how to be compassionate towards self and others.
Yeah, for sure. Any other thoughts about self-compassion, judgment? I know we touch on other topics like mindfulness elsewhere on our podcast, or have and plan to in the future. But I just know that given the psychedelic nature of our podcast, that it bears repeating that one of the reasons we're really excited about psychedelic medicine is because of the ways in which it can help us break free of these judgments, at least even if just for a moment, and learn from that freedom, learn how to practice more self-compassion because we feel connected to the world, connected to others, connected to that collective unconscious, and to see ourselves through a different lens, under different light.
Yeah, and I'll just add one little reminder that we've said in here today already is it's not about not judging. It's about kind of witnessing your judgment and adding that mindful self-compassion into it that I believe is game-changing.
Yeah, yeah. And if folks want resources around self-compassion and acceptance, we've mentioned them a couple times, but Kristen Neff's work, self-compassion, Tara Brach, radical acceptance, radical compassion, are great places to start at least.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Thanks, Reid.
Thank you.
Thank you, dear listener, for listening. It means a lot to me. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Novamind, a mental health company that specializes in psychedelic medicine and research. You can learn more about Novamind's mission to increase access to legal, safe, and evidence-based psychedelic medicine at novamind.ca. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're using to listen or watch. Also, if you're feeling generous today, please leave us a glowing review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. If you'd like to reach out to us with questions, suggestions, scathing criticisms, etc., please email us at psychfrontiers@novamind.ca. Thanks again.